After my wife died, my family abandoned me. I thought it was grief, but then I discovered the dark truth behind their silence. This kind of thing happens to widowed people. I was in my family's good graces up until my wife died, then they ditched me. My wife and I were always highly praised as a model couple in my family, and we were included in all family gatherings. That all ended when I lost my wife. My family came to the funeral and then disappeared forever. They won't even message me a Merry Christmas, much less include me. In all honesty, it started a few months before my wife's death, while she was in hospice care. I noticed that we were getting a lot of concern from her family and friends and our neighbors, but none from my family. For 8 years, I have not been included in family events, and I get virtually no phone calls. My nephew did call a year ago to let me know that my brother was seriously ill, and I visited him in the hospital, but then went back to being an outcast again. At this point, I think they're not talking to me because it would be awkward after so many years, and they'd feel like they'd need to come up with some kind of justification, so they're just being avoidant. The funny thing is that I predicted this. When we knew that my wife's condition was terminal, I was crying and holding her, and I said, "My family's not going to be there for me." She replied, "My family will be your family." She was 100% correct. I have had Sunday dinner with my in-laws every week for the last 8 years. Other widows have told me the same thing. It doesn't happen to every widow, of course, but it's all too common. At this point, I can't forgive them. I'm not sure I want any part of that family from now on. Update 1. So, it's been a while since I last shared my situation, and I've had time to reflect on everything. To recap briefly for those who might be new here, my family more or less abandoned me after my wife died. We were always seen as this model couple within the family, and I had thought we were pretty well liked. We were involved in every family gathering, praised for how great we were together, and people always seemed genuinely happy to see us. All of that changed when my wife passed away. My family came to the funeral, sure, but after that it was like I no longer existed. I guess, in the beginning, I chalked it up to people not knowing how to deal with grief. I figured maybe they were giving me space or didn't know what to say. But as the months rolled on and no one called or reached out, it became pretty clear it wasn't about giving me space. I was just being cut out, plain and simple. My wife's family, on the other hand, they stepped up. Big time. They became my support system, and just like my wife had predicted in her final days, they were there for me in ways my own family never was. For 8 years now, I've been having Sunday dinner with my in-laws. 8 years. And during that time, I haven't heard a peep from my side of the family, aside from one call from my nephew about a year ago to let me know my brother was seriously ill. I visited him in the hospital, thinking maybe this could be a turning point. Maybe it would open the door for reconciliation. But after that visit, nothing changed. I went right back to being the outcast, like I had just done my duty and that was the end of it. I've tried to make sense of it, you know? For years, I tortured myself with questions. Did I do something wrong? Did I somehow offend them during the most painful period of my life, when I wasn't even thinking straight? Or was it just too awkward for them to re-establish contact after they had been absent for so long? At one point, I convinced myself that maybe they thought they were sparing me by keeping their distance, that maybe they felt guilty about abandoning me and just didn't know how to fix it. But recently, I found out the truth, and it's uglier than I ever could have imagined. It all started about 6 months ago, when I bumped into an old family friend at the grocery store. She hadn't seen me in years, and it was clear she didn't know about my situation. She asked about my wife, and when I told her that she had passed 8 years ago, the look on her face was one of pure shock. She asked why I didn't tell anyone in the family. I was confused, obviously, because my whole family had been at the funeral. I told her that. I said, "What are you talking about? My entire family was there." And that's when things started to unravel. Apparently, after the funeral, a rumor had started circulating in my family, and it had spread like wildfire. According to this rumor, My wife hadn't died from the illness we had been battling together for years, but rather, I had been somehow involved in her death. The story varied, depending on who was telling it. Some said I had neglected her, others insinuated something darker, that maybe I had hastened her death or contributed to her suffering in some way. I was completely blindsided. I had no idea that this was even a thing, let alone the reason why my family had ghosted me for the better part of a decade. The friend who told me this said she didn't believe the rumors, but she also said that they had been circulating for so long that people just assumed they were true. She added that, because of this, my family had distanced themselves from me out of fear or disgust or whatever. I was furious, absolutely livid. But more than anything, I was heartbroken. To think that my family, people I had trusted and loved my entire life, could believe something so horrendous about me, without ever asking me directly, without ever giving me a chance to defend myself. It was soul-crushing. And the worst part? They had no reason to believe it. They had all seen my wife's decline. They had seen her in the hospital, at home, in hospice care. They knew the reality of what was happening. But somehow, this poisonous lie had taken hold, and none of them ever thought to question it. I'm not sure what's worse, the fact that they believed it, or the fact that they didn't care enough about me to even check if it was true. They were willing to cut me out of their lives completely, based on nothing more than hearsay and speculation. And now, 8 years later, I'm finding out that this has been the reason all along. They didn't abandon me because they didn't know how to comfort me. They didn't disappear because they thought I needed space to grieve. They walked away because they thought I had done something monstrous, and they never even bothered to find out the truth. After I got home from that conversation, I spent days trying to figure out what to do with this information. Should I confront my family? Should I call them up, one by one, and demand an explanation? Part of me wanted to burn the whole thing to the ground, to scream at them for what they had done to me. But another part of me, the part that had been abandoned and isolated for so long, just felt tired. I didn't know if I had the energy to fight that battle. It felt like too little, too late. In the end, I decided to reach out to my nephew, the one who had called me about my brother. He's the only one who has ever made any effort to include me, so I figured if anyone was going to tell me the truth, it would be him. I called him up, and to my surprise, he answered right away. We made small talk for a few minutes, and then I just went for it. I told him everything, the rumors, the gossip, the years of abandonment. I asked him point blank, "Is this true? Did the family really believe that I was involved in my wife's death?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Yeah, that's why. They thought you did something." He didn't sound accusatory, just sad, like he knew how messed up it was but didn't know how to fix it. He told me that after the funeral, one of my cousins had made an offhand comment about how strange I had been acting in the months leading up to my wife's death, and from there, the speculation started. By the time it reached the rest of the family, it had morphed into something completely unrecognizable. I asked him why no one ever asked me directly, and his response was simple. I don't know. People just talked. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. For 8 years, I've been living in the shadow of a lie, and now that I finally know the truth, I don't even know what to do with it. Update 2. So, after I found out that my family had abandoned me because of some ridiculous, baseless rumor, I spent the next few weeks in a haze of anger and confusion. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily they had turned their backs on me, how quickly they believed the worst about me without so much as a single phone call to ask me what really happened. For 8 years, I was left in the dark, isolated, with no explanation. Now that I had one, I didn't know if it made things better or worse. At first, I considered just letting it go. I thought about burying it, just like I had buried everything else for almost a decade. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't. This wasn't something I could just sweep under the rug. These were the people who were supposed to care about me, who were supposed to be my support system after my wife passed. Instead, they tossed me aside, all because of a twisted lie. I had to confront them. So, I started making a plan. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and I knew I had to approach this carefully. My emotions were all over the place: rage, sadness, betrayal, and I didn't want to let those take over. I wanted answers. I wanted to know who started the rumors and why no one had the decency to come to me with their concerns. Most of all, I wanted to know if there was any chance of salvaging a relationship with them after all of this. I wasn't sure if I even wanted that, but I needed to know if it was possible. I decided to start with my brother. He's the one I visited in the hospital when he was seriously ill, and despite the fact that nothing changed after that visit, I figured he might be the most reasonable one. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year, but I thought maybe I could get him to be honest with me, especially since he had once called me in a time of need. I texted him first, asking if we could meet up for coffee. It took a few days, but eventually he agreed. We met at a small cafe that we used to go to when we were younger, back when things were normal between us. Sitting across from him after all these years was surreal. He looked older, more tired, like life had worn him down in ways I hadn't noticed before. I don't know if it was because of his illness or something else, but there was a heaviness about him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as we sat down, he asked, "Why did you want to meet?" I didn't beat around the bush. I told him straight up what I had learned, that the family had cut me off because of some sick rumor that I had something to do with my wife's death. I watched his face closely, trying to read his expression, but he just looked down at his coffee cup, like he couldn't meet my eyes. That silence told me everything I needed to know. "I just want to know why," I said. "Why did no one come to me? Why did everyone believe something so ridiculous? You all knew what was happening. You saw her getting sicker. You were at the funeral. Why would you think I had anything to do with her death?" He sighed, finally looking up at me. "It wasn't that simple," he said. "People were talking, and after a while, I don't know, it just became easier to believe that something was off. You were acting strange, man. You disappeared for a while during the worst of it, and people noticed. You weren't answering calls. You weren't talking to anyone. It just looked suspicious." I could feel my blood boiling. "I wasn't talking to anyone because my wife was dying," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you have any idea what that's like? Do you know what it's like to watch the person you love waste away in front of you, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it?" I wasn't acting strange. I was grieving. I was barely holding it together. He nodded slowly, but I wasn't sure if he really understood. "I get that now," he said. "But at the time, it just felt like there was something more going on. I didn't believe it at first, but then..." "But then what?" I asked, leaning forward. "What changed?" He hesitated. "Look, I didn't want to believe it, but after a while everyone else was so sure. And then our cousin, she started talking about how you weren't around much, how you seemed distant even before things got really bad with your wife. She said she overheard you talking to someone at the funeral about regrets, and that's when it all spiraled." I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. "Regrets? Of course I had regrets. Who wouldn't in that situation? That doesn't mean I did anything wrong." I know, he said quickly. "But you know how people are. They hear one thing and run with it, and after that, it just spread." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own family had turned their backs on me because of some vague comment overheard at a funeral. It was beyond absurd. And yet somehow, it had been enough to convince them that I was capable of, I don't even know what. Something sinister, apparently. "Why didn't you ever ask me?" I demanded. "Why didn't anyone ask me? You just went along with it, let the rumors grow and didn't say a damn thing to me. You all just left me." My brother's face softened. but there was something defensive in his eyes. I don't know, man. By the time I thought about reaching out, too much time had passed. It felt awkward, I guess. Like, what was I supposed to say after all that time? Maybe start with the truth, I said bitterly. Maybe ask your brother if he's okay, instead of assuming the worst. There was a long silence between us. He looked like he wanted to say more, but no words came out. Finally, he just shook his head. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I really am. I didn't know how to fix it. I wasn't sure if I believed him. Sorry. What did sorry even mean at this point? 8 years of abandonment, 8 years of being treated like an outcast, and all I got was a half-hearted apology? It didn't feel like enough. But at the same time, I could see that my brother wasn't the mastermind behind this whole thing. He had been a bystander, swept up in the rumors and too cowardly to speak out. It hurt, but I wasn't surprised. He had always been passive, going along with whatever the majority thought. It was easier for him to go with the flow than to stand up for what was right. I knew I needed to confront the real source of all this, the cousin he mentioned. She had been the one stirring the pot, spreading her suspicions and turning my family against me. I didn't know how she got the idea in her head that I was somehow involved in my wife's death, but I was determined to find out. The next day, I called her. She didn't answer, of course. It took a few tries, but eventually she picked up. The conversation started out polite enough, but I didn't waste any time getting to the point. I know you've been spreading rumors about me, I said flatly. I know you're the reason the family thinks I had something to do with my wife's death. So, I want to know why. Her reaction was unexpected. She didn't deny it. She didn't try to act shocked or confused. Instead, she let out a long sigh and said, I always knew this would come back around. My stomach dropped. What the hell does that mean? I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said. But, well, I just didn't trust you back then. You were so distant. You wouldn't let anyone in, wouldn't talk to anyone. And yeah, I overheard you at the funeral and it just clicked. I thought maybe you were hiding something. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you thought I was guilty of what? Killing my wife? Neglecting her? What? I don't know, she said. I didn't have a concrete theory, but something just felt off, and I went with it. You went with it? I repeated, incredulous. You destroyed my life because something felt off? She didn't have much to say after that. She apologized, but it felt empty. Just like my brother's apology, it didn't change the fact that they had ruined my relationship with the rest of my family over nothing but baseless assumptions. At this point, I'm not sure where to go from here. I don't know if I can ever truly forgive them. And honestly, I'm not even sure I want to.